A collision of worlds. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the Franklin County Courthouse, but inside, the air was tense with anticipation. By 9 a.m., the courtroom was packed, filled with a mix of curious onlookers, journalists, and legal professionals. The case on the docket wasn't the sort to make national headlines, yet it had captured the town's attention. Ethan Rowland, the only son of a powerful real estate mogul, was set to appear before Judge Henry Porter, a man known for his unwavering sense of justice. Ethan's reputation preceded him. At just 19, he had become infamous in the community for his reckless behavior, lavish parties, and blatant disregard for rules. His wealth shielded him from the consequences most people would face, and his arrogance only grew with each escaped punishment. This time, however, he wasn't dealing with traffic officers willing to look the other way. This time, he faced Judge Porter. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people took their seats, the atmosphere charged with a mix of curiosity and schadenfreude. Ethan's arrival was as ostentatious as his lifestyle. He strolled in 15 minutes late, dressed in a designer hoodie and sneakers, his expensive cologne preceding him. The hush that followed his entrance was more of disbelief than respect. Ethan seemed oblivious to the attention, chewing gum loudly as he tossed his backpack onto the defendant's table. His lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Victor Mallory, followed closely, visibly uncomfortable with his client's demeanor. Victor leaned in, whispering urgently, "Ethan, you can't act like this in front of Judge Porter. He's not someone you want to disrespect." Ethan waved him off with a smirk. "Relax, Vic. It's just another old guy in a robe. I'll pay the fine, maybe do some community service, and we're out of here." Victor sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. This wasn't going to be easy. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room instantly fell silent. Judge Henry Porter entered with an air of quiet authority. In his mid-50s, he was a tall, imposing figure, his sharp features softened only by a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. His reputation as a no-nonsense arbiter of justice made him a figure of both respect and fear in the legal community. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the silence. The courtroom stood in unison, everyone except Ethan, who hesitated before standing with a dramatic sigh, his expression one of mild annoyance. Judge Porter's piercing gaze swept the room before settling on Ethan, lingering for a moment before he took his seat. "Be seated," the judge instructed. As the room complied, he opened the file before him, the faint rustle of paper the only sound. "This court is now in session for the matter of Ethan Rowland versus the state of Franklin." The charges were read aloud. Multiple traffic violations, including running red lights and speeding, culminating in an incident of reckless driving that endangered the life of a cyclist, Diego Alvarez. What could have been a routine hearing was about to turn into a spectacle, thanks to Ethan's arrogance. As the judge spoke, Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and rolling his eyes. His body language screamed indifference. The tension in the room was palpable. Even seasoned courtroom regulars seemed to sense that this case would not follow the usual script. "Mr. Rowland," Judge Porter began, his tone measured but firm, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Ethan barely glanced up. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Some tickets and some guy overreacting." "Got it." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Victor buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. Judge Porter, however, remained unflappable. He adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward. "In this courtroom, Mr. Rowland, we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Ethan smirked. "Sure thing, Your Honor," he said, his voice laden with mockery. The room fell deathly silent. Even the faint sound of the court reporter's pen paused for a moment. Judge Porter's calm expression didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly, betraying a hint of steel beneath his professional demeanor. "Let me clarify something for you, Mr. Rowland," the judge continued. "This is not a casual discussion. The charges against you are serious. Your actions not only violated traffic laws, but also endangered the life of another person. Do you understand the gravity of that?" Ethan shrugged, the smirk still playing on his lips. "Sure, whatever you say." Judge Porter closed the file in front of him with deliberate precision, the soft thud echoing through the room. Time seemed to pause as he fixed Ethan with an unyielding gaze. "Mr. Rowland, your flippant attitude is concerning," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Perhaps you believe that your wealth and privilege exempt you from accountability. Let me assure you, they do not." Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair as if bored. "Look, I didn't even hit the guy. He's fine. This is just a waste of everyone's time." Judge Porter's expression remained impassive, but the tension in the room grew thicker. He turned to the bailiff. "Is Mr. Alvarez present in the courtroom?" The bailiff nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. He is seated in the second row." All eyes turned to the man in question. Diego Alvarez was a middle-aged father of two, his arm in a sling, his face etched with a quiet dignity. His presence added a human dimension to the case that no amount of legal jargon could erase. "Mr. Alvarez," the judge said, his tone softening slightly, "thank you for being here today. Your courage is noted." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado cracking under the weight of the moment. Judge Porter turned his attention back to him. "Mr. Rowland, your dismissal of this man's pain and suffering is troubling. Perhaps you need a more tangible reminder of the consequences of your actions." The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Porter paused, his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Ethan's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Ethan brushed him off again, his confidence wavering but not entirely gone. "Let's proceed," the judge said, picking up a pen and gesturing for the bailiff to bring forward the sentencing documents. "It's time to determine the appropriate course of action for someone who believes they are above accountability." Ethan's cocky grin was gone now, replaced by a flicker of genuine worry. For the first time, it seemed to dawn on him that this hearing might not end the way he had expected. And this was only the beginning. Reality strikes. The morning's proceedings had been a shock to Ethan Rowland, though he would never admit it. His typical swagger had been met with an immovable force in Judge Henry Porter, and now, as the second phase of the hearing began, Ethan found himself in uncharted territory. The courtroom settled as the bailiff called the next witness to the stand, Diego Alvarez. Ethan watched as the cyclist rose from his seat, moving with deliberate care due to the sling immobilizing his injured arm. Alvarez's presence seemed to magnify the weight of the charges, and for the first time, Ethan appeared genuinely uncomfortable. Diego Alvarez was not a man of great means or stature, but his quiet dignity filled the room. A delivery driver by trade, he had worked tirelessly to provide for his two children after his wife passed away. That he was now unable to work due to the injuries sustained in Ethan's reckless driving incident was a fact not lost on anyone present. The prosecutor approached Alvarez, speaking gently. "Mr. Alvarez, thank you for joining us today. Could you please describe the events of that morning in your own words?" Alvarez nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "It was just another day for me," he began, his words carrying the cadence of someone used to hard work. "I was delivering groceries to a family on the east side. The bike lane on Main Street is usually safe, so I wasn't expecting any trouble. But then, out of nowhere, I heard the roar of an engine." Ethan shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with the man he had endangered. Alvarez continued. "I looked back and saw a car speeding toward me. I had no time to react. The driver," he glanced briefly at Ethan, "honked aggressively, and I swerved to avoid being hit. My bike skidded, and I went down hard. I could feel something snap in my shoulder right away." The courtroom was silent except for the occasional scratch of the court reporter's pen. Even the spectators, many of whom had come out of curiosity, were now gripped by the raw humanity of Alvarez's testimony. The prosecutor nodded. And what happened after that? Alvarez's expression darkened. I looked up to see the car speeding away. No one stopped to help. I had to call 911 myself. By the time help arrived, I was in so much pain I could barely speak. The judge's gaze flicked toward Ethan, whose usual bravado had dissolved into visible discomfort. "Thank you, Mr. Alvarez," the prosecutor said, stepping back. "Your Honor, the state rests its case." Judge Porter turned to Victor Mallory, Ethan's lawyer. "Mr. Mallory, would you like to cross-examine the witness?" Victor hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who gave a slight shake of his head. "No, Your Honor," he said, sitting down. "Very well," the judge replied, turning to Alvarez. "You may step down. Thank you for your testimony." As Alvarez returned to his seat, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The human toll of Ethan's actions had been laid bare, and the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Ethan's moment of reckoning. Judge Porter leaned forward, his expression as unyielding as ever. "Mr. Rowland, the testimony we've heard today paints a troubling picture, not just of your actions, but of your attitude toward those actions. Before we proceed to sentencing, I'd like to hear directly from you. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ethan hesitated, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. He glanced at Victor, who gave him an imploring look to choose his words carefully. Finally, Ethan stood, shoving his hands into his pockets. I'm sorry, okay," he said, his voice lacking conviction. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. It was just, look, I wasn't trying to hit the guy. I was in a rush, that's all." Judge Porter's expression didn't change, but his silence was deafening. When Ethan trailed off, the judge finally spoke. "Mr. Rowland, your apology, such as it is, seems to lack sincerity. Rushing is no excuse for endangering another person's life, and yet, even now, you fail to grasp the seriousness of your actions. Do you understand the consequences of what you've done?" Ethan shrugged, his voice defensive. "I already said I was sorry. What else do you want from me?" The judge's eyes narrowed, his calm exterior betraying a flicker of irritation. "What I want, Mr. Rowland, is accountability. What I want is for you to acknowledge not just the inconvenience this incident has caused you, but the profound impact it has had on Mr. Alvarez and his family. You have the means to repair a portion of the damage you've done, yet you refuse to take responsibility. This speaks to a deeper issue." The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan's face reddened as he squirmed under the judge's unrelenting gaze. Judge Porter continued, "Privilege is not a shield against accountability, Mr. Rowland. If anything, it comes with a greater responsibility to act with integrity. Your behavior today, both in this courtroom and on the day of the incident, suggests that you believe the rules do not apply to you. That ends here." Ethan's voice rose in frustration. "But I didn't even hit him. How is this fair?" The judge's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Fair? Fair would be Mr. Alvarez riding home to his children without injuries, without the loss of his livelihood. Fair would be you recognizing the harm you've caused and making amends. This, Mr. Rowland, is justice." The sentence. Judge Porter picked up a stack of documents, scanning them briefly before speaking. "Given the circumstances, the court has decided on the following sentence. Mr. Rowland will pay restitution to Mr. Alvarez, covering all medical expenses and lost wages. In addition, you will complete 500 hours of community service, specifically working with organizations that support victims of reckless driving." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand. "Furthermore," he continued, "you will attend mandatory educational courses on road safety and the consequences of negligent behavior. And finally, your driver's license will be suspended for 1 year." The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Ethan's face turned pale as the reality of his punishment sank in. "Do you understand your sentence, Mr. Rowland?" Judge Porter asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan nodded reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good," the judge replied. "Let this be a lesson to you. Mr. Rowland, privilege does not exempt you from responsibility. Court is adjourned. As the gavel struck, the room erupted into hushed conversation. Ethan slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions, and their consequences, finally settling on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he couldn't buy his way out of trouble. This was justice, plain and simple. A taste of consequences. Ethan Rowland sat alone in his father's sleek black car, his head against the cold leather headrest, staring blankly out the window. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty now, save for a few reporters lingering by the exits, hoping for a last-minute quote or photograph. Ethan's lawyer, Victor Mallory, had left in a hurry, his parting words a mix of frustration and concern. "You've dug yourself a hole, Ethan," Victor had said. "Now it's up to you to climb out. Don't make it any worse." Ethan had rolled his eyes as Victor walked away, but the weight of the morning's events was undeniable. His privileged bubble had been punctured, and the real world was seeping in. The judge's words echoed in his mind. Privilege is not a shield against accountability. His father's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Get in," Thomas Rowland barked, his tone as sharp as the tailored suit he wore. Thomas was a man who commanded rooms and closed deals with ease, but today his face was tight with disappointment. Ethan slid into the passenger seat without a word. The tension between them was thick, the silence broken only by the soft purr of the car engine. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice cold. Ethan crossed his arms, his tone defensive. "I said I was sorry. What else do you want from me?" Thomas slammed his hand against the steering wheel, startling Ethan. "I want you to grow up," he snapped. "This isn't about me bailing you out or throwing money at the problem. This is about you taking responsibility for once in your life." Ethan turned to face the window, his jaw clenched. He hated being lectured, especially by his father, whose constant pressure had always felt suffocating. "I didn't even hit the guy," Ethan muttered under his breath. But Thomas heard him. "And yet, here we are," Thomas replied, his tone cutting. "Because you can't grasp that your actions have consequences, whether you physically hit him or not. You caused harm." The rest of the drive was silent, both men too entrenched in their frustration to continue the conversation. The start of the sentence. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood in front of a modest community center on the outskirts of town, his designer hoodie and sneakers sharply out of place among the peeling paint and worn-down steps. This was where he would complete the first portion of his court-mandated community service, volunteering with a local program that helped victims of reckless driving rebuild their lives. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets as the program director, a no-nonsense woman named Claire McAdams, approached him. In her late 40s, Claire exuded an air of authority that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of Judge Porter. "You must be Ethan Rowland," Claire said, extending a hand. "Welcome to the program." Ethan gave her a reluctant handshake, his grip weak. "Yeah, that's me," he muttered. Claire raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment on his lack of enthusiasm. "Follow me," she said, leading him inside. The community center was a hive of activity. Volunteers bustled about, sorting supplies, setting up tables, and greeting visitors. The walls were lined with photographs and stories of people whose lives had been upended by reckless drivers. A young woman in a wheelchair who had lost the use of her legs, an elderly man who had to learn to walk again after a hit and run, a grieving mother holding a picture of her teenage son. Ethan's stomach tightened as he walked past the displays. The weight of what he had been trying to dismiss for weeks now felt inescapable. Claire stopped in front of a table piled high with forms and clipboards. "You'll be assisting with intake today," she said. "We're hosting a support group this afternoon for victims and their families. Your job is to greet people, help them fill out the forms, and direct them to the meeting room." Ethan nodded stiffly. "Got it." Claire didn't move, her sharp eyes studying him. "This isn't a punishment, Ethan. It's an opportunity for you to learn, to grow, and to make amends. Don't waste it." Ethan didn't respond, But her words stayed with him as he settled behind the table. Faces of consequences. The first person to approach the table was a young man in his early 20s, his left arm wrapped in a heavy brace. He looked hesitant as he picked up a clipboard. "Name?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Ryan," the man replied. "Ryan Peters." As Ryan filled out the form, Ethan couldn't help but notice the scars running along his forearm and the faint limp in his step. He tried to suppress the uncomfortable knot in his chest. "What happened to your arm?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Ryan glanced up, his expression guarded. "Car accident. Guy was texting and didn't see me crossing the street." Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched awkwardly until Ryan finished his form and handed it back. "Meeting rooms down the hall," Ethan said, motioning with his hand. Ryan nodded, but before he left, he turned back to Ethan. "You're new here, huh?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. Ryan's eyes lingered on him for a moment, as if trying to place him. "Good luck," he said finally, before walking away. Ethan watched him go, the knot in his chest tightening. The first shift. By the end of the day, Ethan had met dozens of people. A mother pushing her toddler in a stroller, a man in a neck brace, a teenager whose face was partially obscured by a surgical mask. Each story chipped away at the wall of indifference Ethan had built around himself. When his shift ended, Claire found him in the break room, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. "Tough first day?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Ethan shrugged. "It's just a lot." Claire nodded, her expression softening. "It is, but that's the point. Change doesn't come from staying comfortable." Ethan looked down at his coffee, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet uncertainty. I didn't realize how much this stuff affects people." Claire leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You're starting to get it, Ethan, but this is just the beginning. The question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" Ethan didn't have an answer, but for the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, the desire to figure it out. A shift in perspective. Ethan Rowland had underestimated just how much his sentence would change him, or challenge him. A month into his community service, his time at the community center was beginning to chip away at his carefully constructed sense of entitlement. Every day brought him face to face with individuals whose lives had been irreversibly altered by reckless driving, each story a mirror reflecting his own actions back at him. This shift didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, creeping in through small moments he couldn't ignore. Morning conversations. On a chilly Tuesday morning, Ethan arrived at the community center early, something he wouldn't have dreamed of doing a few weeks ago. He didn't come for the free coffee or to impress anyone. He came because he wanted to. He was sitting at the intake desk, preparing for the day's group session, when he saw Ryan Peters again, the young man with the arm brace. Over the past few weeks, Ryan had become a regular at the center. Ethan had seen him in passing, but hadn't had the chance to really talk to him since their brief exchange on Ethan's first day. "Hey," Ryan said, setting his clipboard down on the desk. "You're still here. Didn't think you'd last this long." Ethan chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, I don't really have a choice." Ryan smirked. "You have more of a choice than you think. Most people would have found a way to fake it by now. Do the bare minimum and get out." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe I'm just bad at faking things." Ryan laughed, the sound easy and genuine. "Fair enough. So, what's your story? Why are you here?" Ethan hesitated, debating whether to give his usual dismissive answer. But something about Ryan's open demeanor made him feel like honesty was worth a shot. "Reckless driving," Ethan admitted. "I almost hit a cyclist. The judge wasn't exactly thrilled with my attitude." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, at least you're here. That's something." Ethan looked at him curiously. "What about you? You come here a lot." Ryan gestured to his arm brace. "This is my second time recovering from an accident. First time was when I was 16. Some guy ran a red light and T-boned my mom's car. Second time was about a year ago. Someone clipped me while I was walking my dog. Seriously? Ethan asked, his stomach sinking. Yeah, Ryan said, his tone matter-of-fact. You get used to it after a while, but it doesn't get easier. Ethan didn't know what to say. For the first time, he realized how naive he'd been to think his actions wouldn't leave lasting scars. A new challenge. Later that day, Claire approached Ethan with a request. Ethan, I need someone to help with the support group today. Ryan's leading the discussion, but we need a second person to manage the breakout session. Think you're up for it? Ethan blinked in surprise. Me? Why me? Claire smiled. Because I think you're ready for it. And because you've been listening more than you think. He hesitated but eventually nodded. Okay, I'll do it. When the session began, Ethan found himself sitting in a circle of chairs, surrounded by people who had experienced varying degrees of trauma. Ryan started the discussion, his calm, confident demeanor setting the tone. Today's focus is on resilience, Ryan said. How do we move forward after something life-changing? How do we find new ways to live, even when things feel impossible? The group members began sharing their stories. One woman spoke about learning to drive again after losing her leg in an accident. A young man talked about finding strength in art therapy after losing his brother. As Ethan listened, he felt a lump rise in his throat. These weren't just stories. They were testimonies of strength, of finding light in the darkest places. Ethan speaks. When the group broke into smaller circles, Ethan found himself leading a discussion with 4 participants. He was nervous, but as the conversation unfolded, he realized how much he had learned just by being present over the past month. A middle-aged man named Greg, who had been injured in a hit-and-run, spoke about his struggle with anger. It's hard not to think about what I've lost, Greg said, his voice heavy. I can't work the same way anymore. I can't run with my kids. I keep asking myself, why me? Ethan surprised himself by speaking up. I don't think there's a good answer to that, he said. But I think maybe it's not about finding an answer. Maybe it's about figuring out what you do with what's left. Greg looked at him, startled. You sound like you've thought about this a lot. Ethan hesitated. I've been thinking about it more lately. Honestly, I used to be one of those people who didn't think about how my actions affected anyone else. Being here, it's changed that. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of connection to the people around him. Their pain, their resilience, it wasn't just something to observe. It was something to learn from, something to carry with him. The ride home. When the day ended, Ethan sat in the back of a rideshare car, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. He thought about the stories he'd heard, the people he'd met, and the weight of his own actions. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like a spectator to other people's struggles. He felt like a participant in something larger than himself, a community, a shared humanity. And as the car pulled up to his house, Ethan realized something else. He didn't want this feeling to end. He didn't want to go back to the person he'd been before. Change, he thought, wasn't about grand gestures or sudden transformations. It was about small, quiet moments that added up over time. Moments like today. Bridging the gap. Ethan Rowland stood in front of the community center early one Saturday morning, the air crisp with the promise of spring. The last month had been a whirlwind of experiences, stories of pain, recovery, and resilience. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was part of something meaningful. Yet, an uneasiness lingered within him, a sense that his journey wasn't complete. Today was different. He wasn't just here to fulfill his community service hours. He was here for a conversation he'd been avoiding since his sentencing. Diego Alvarez, the cyclist whose life Ethan had upended, had agreed to meet him. A face-to-face reckoning. Ethan had seen Diego from a distance during the court hearing. Back then, Ethan's arrogance had shielded him from fully acknowledging the impact of his actions. But now, as Diego approached, his arm still in a sling and his face etched with quiet determination, Ethan felt the full weight of his guilt. Mr. Alvarez, Ethan asked hesitantly, extending a hand. Diego shook it firmly. Just Diego is fine, he said. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone of pain that Ethan couldn't ignore. They sat across from each other at a small outdoor table near the community center. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan stared at the table, unsure of how to begin. "Thank you for meeting me," Ethan finally said. Diego nodded. "I almost didn't, but Claire said you've been making progress. She thought it might help both of us to talk." Ethan looked up, meeting Diego's eyes. "I'm not sure I deserve that." Diego's expression softened, but only slightly. "Maybe not, but you're here, and that's a start." Diego's story. Diego leaned back in his chair, adjusting the sling on his shoulder. "Do you know what I remember most about that day?" he asked. Ethan shook his head, his stomach twisting. "It wasn't the sound of your car or the pain of hitting the ground. It was the look on my kids' faces when I came home that night," Diego said, his voice breaking slightly. "They were scared, Ethan. Scared that their dad might not come back next time." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt pressing down on him like a physical weight. "I never thought about what it was like for you," he admitted. "I was too busy thinking about how unfair everything felt for me." Diego studied him for a moment. "Why are you really here, Ethan? Is this just part of your sentence, or do you actually want to make things right?" Ethan hesitated, but only for a moment. "I used to think this was just about checking a box," he said. "But the more time I spent here, the more I've realized how much damage I caused, not just to you, but to your family, to everyone who depends on you. I can't change what happened, but I want to take responsibility for it. I want to do better." A turning point. Diego nodded slowly, as if weighing Ethan's words. "Taking responsibility is a good start," he said. "But it's not just about saying the right things. It's about action." Ethan leaned forward, his voice earnest. "What can I do? I mean it. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Diego was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. "Start by listening," he said. "Not just to me, but to the people you meet here. Hear their stories, learn from them, and let that change the way you live your life. Because this isn't just about me, Ethan. It's about the kind of person you want to be moving forward." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I will. I promise." A day of service. After their conversation, Diego joined Ethan for a volunteer shift at the community center. It was a busy day, with a special event planned for local families affected by reckless driving. Ethan found himself working side by side with Diego, setting up tables, organizing supplies, and welcoming guests. As the day went on, Ethan saw a different side of Diego. Despite his injury, Diego was patient, kind, and quick to lend a hand. He joked with the kids, listened intently to the adults, and treated everyone with respect. By the end of the event, Ethan felt a sense of camaraderie he hadn't expected. "Thank you," Ethan said as they packed up the last of the supplies. Diego raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For giving me a chance," Ethan said. "For showing me what it looks like to move forward, even when it's hard." Diego smiled, his expression softer than it had been all day. "Just remember, Ethan, this is only the beginning. Keep doing the work, and maybe one day you'll be the one helping someone else move forward." Reflection. That night, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the pile of notes and stories he'd collected from the community center. Each one was a reminder of the lives he had touched, some for the worse, but many now for the better. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was part of something meaningful. And as he thought about Diego's words, he realized that his journey wasn't just about redemption. It was about transformation. He picked up a pen and began to write, not knowing where the words would lead him, but feeling certain that this was the first step toward something greater, a deeper connection. The day had left Ethan emotionally drained but strangely at peace. Sitting in his room, surrounded by the weight of everything he'd experienced, he replayed his conversation with Diego. He thought about the resilience it took for someone like Diego to face the person who had caused him so much pain and still choose to help. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts wandered to the stories he'd heard at the community center, the struggles, the triumphs, and the quiet strength of people who had endured more than he could imagine. He reached for his notebook, flipping through pages filled with notes and observations from his time there. He'd started jotting things down at Claire's suggestion, but now those pages felt like a map of his journey, one that was far from over. An unexpected visitor. The next morning, as Ethan was preparing to leave for the community center, his father stopped him in the hallway. Dressed in his usual tailored suit, Mr. Rowland looked as polished as ever, but there was something different in his expression. "Ethan," his father began, his voice unusually hesitant, "I've been meaning to talk to you." Ethan froze. Conversations with his father were typically one-sided, filled with lectures or veiled disappointment. This felt different. "Yeah," Ethan said, bracing himself. "I've noticed a change in you lately," his father continued. "You've been different, more focused. Your mother and I weren't sure this whole community service thing would do much, but it seems like it's had an effect." Ethan frowned, unsure whether to take the comment as a compliment or a backhanded critique. "I guess it has," he said carefully. His father nodded, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're taking this seriously. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I'm proud of you for sticking with it." Ethan blinked, startled. His father's approval was something he'd long stopped seeking, but hearing those words now felt strangely validating. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan said quietly. Mr. Rowland clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Keep it up. You're on the right track." As his father walked away, Ethan felt a surge of determination. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was doing this for himself and for the people he'd hurt. Building trust. When Ethan arrived at the community center that day, Claire greeted him with a warm smile. "Morning, Ethan. How are you feeling after yesterday?" "Better," Ethan admitted. "Talking to Diego. It helped. A lot." Claire nodded. "I thought it might. He's been through a lot, but he's one of the strongest people I know." Ethan hesitated. "Do you think he forgives me?" Claire's smile softened. "Forgiveness is complicated, Ethan. It's not something you can force or rush, but the fact that he's willing to work with you, that says a lot." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. Throughout the day, Ethan found himself taking on more responsibilities than usual. He helped set up a new resource corner for accident survivors, organized donation drives, and even started brainstorming ideas for a fundraiser. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. By the end of the week, Claire pulled him aside. "You're becoming a real asset to this place," she said. "Have you thought about staying on after your sentence is complete?" Ethan blinked in surprise. "You'd want me to stay?" "Absolutely," Claire said. "You've got a way of connecting with people, Ethan. And you're learning to use that for something good. That's rare." The idea of staying on hadn't crossed Ethan's mind, but as he considered it, he felt a spark of excitement. Maybe this was his chance to turn a punishment into a purpose. A letter to Diego. That night, Ethan sat down with his notebook and began writing a letter to Diego. He wanted to express everything he hadn't been able to say during their conversation: his regret, his gratitude, and his commitment to change. "Dear Diego, I don't know if I'll ever fully understand the pain I caused you and your family, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. Meeting you and hearing your story has been one of the hardest but most important things I've ever done. You taught me something I'll never forget, that our actions have consequences far beyond what we can see. I used to think my choices only affected me, but now I know better. I'm not just saying this to make myself feel better or to check a box. I mean it when I say I want to do better, not just for you, but for everyone I've let down. Thank you for giving me a chance to see things from your perspective. I don't take that lightly. Sincerely, Ethan." a step forward. The next day, Ethan handed the letter to Claire, asking her to pass it along to Diego. He wasn't sure how it would be received, but he knew it was a step he needed to take. As he left the community center that evening, Ethan felt a quiet sense of resolve. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to make amends. The ripple effect. Ethan Rowland stared at the large auditorium in the Franklin County Community Center, which was now abuzz with activity. The event tonight was unlike anything Ethan had ever imagined himself a part of, a fundraiser to support families affected by reckless driving. What made it even more surreal was that Ethan had been asked to speak. Weeks of working at the center had transformed him, both in action and in thought. Claire had seen his progress, and so had Diego. When the idea of the fundraiser was first proposed, Ethan had thrown himself into the planning. He'd reached out to local businesses, arranged for food vendors to donate meals, and even convinced his parents to sponsor part of the event. But giving a speech, that felt like another challenge entirely. Facing the crowd. As the evening progressed, the seats filled quickly. Families, friends, and community members gathered to show support. Diego Alvarez stood near the front, his children sitting beside him. Their presence made Ethan's chest tighten. "Are you ready?" Claire asked, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I think so," Ethan replied, though his palms were sweaty and his heart raced. Claire smiled. "Just speak from the heart. You've got this." When his name was called, Ethan walked to the stage. The spotlight felt blinding, and the murmur of the crowd faded as he stepped up to the microphone. He glanced at Diego, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. A personal confession. "Good evening, everyone," Ethan began, his voice slightly shaky. "Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Ethan Rowland, and if I'm being honest, I never thought I'd be standing in front of you like this." He paused, taking a deep breath. "A few months ago, I was a different person. I thought the world revolved around me. I thought my actions didn't have consequences, or if they did, they were someone else's problem. That's what brought me here." Ethan's voice steadied as he continued. "I made a terrible mistake. I acted recklessly, and in doing so, I hurt someone. Someone who didn't deserve it. Diego Alvarez was riding his bike when I thought it was okay to put my foot on the gas and treat the road like my personal racetrack. I didn't think about what could happen. I didn't think about anyone but myself." The room was silent, every eye on Ethan. He swallowed hard. Diego could have died that day, and I wouldn't just be standing here apologizing. I'd be living with something far worse. But instead, Diego did something I never expected. He forgave me. He gave me a chance to make things right. The power of community. Ethan's gaze swept across the crowd. Working here at the community center has taught me more than I ever learned in school or anywhere else. I've met people who have faced unimaginable challenges and still find ways to keep going. People like Diego, who chose compassion over anger. People like Claire, who dedicate their lives to helping others. He paused, gathering his thoughts. This event isn't just about raising money. It's about raising awareness. Reckless driving doesn't just happen on the road. It happens when we forget that other people's lives matter. It happens when we stop caring about the impact of our choices. Ethan's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "I'm not the same person I was, and I'm standing here today because I want to be better. Because I want to help make sure no one else has to go through what Diego and his family went through." A message of hope. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. To anyone out there who thinks their actions don't matter, they do. They matter more than you can imagine. And it's never too late to change. I'm proof of that. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. He stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding. As he descended the stage, Diego was the first to greet him. "You did good, kid," Diego said, clapping him on the back. Ethan smiled, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you for everything." The ripple effect. The fundraiser was a resounding success, raising more than enough to support new safety programs and resources for affected families. Ethan stayed late to help clean up, his mind buzzing with ideas for what more he could do. By the time he left the community center, the night air was cool and quiet. Ethan looked up at the stars, a rare sense of peace settling over him. His journey wasn't over. It would never truly be over. But he was on the right path. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Rowland felt like he was making a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And that was a feeling worth holding on to. The next chapter. The night of the fundraiser lingered in Ethan's mind long after the event ended. For the first time, he had felt part of something larger than himself, a ripple in a sea of change that touched more lives than he ever imagined. Diego's words stayed with him as he walked home under the streetlights. "You did good, kid." Simple, but coming from Diego, they carried a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. A new perspective. The following weeks marked the conclusion of Ethan's court-mandated community service. On his last official day of the center, Claire gathered the staff and volunteers to acknowledge his contributions. "Ethan has come a long way since he first walked through those doors," Claire began, smiling warmly at him. "He started as someone fulfilling an obligation, but he became a true part of our team. He's shown us that anyone can grow if they're willing to learn." The small group erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. When the noise died down, Claire turned to him. "So, Ethan, now that your service is officially complete, what's next? Are we going to see you around here, or are you running for the hills?" Ethan laughed nervously, but didn't hesitate in his reply. "Actually, I'd like to stay on. Voluntarily, this time." The room cheered, and Claire nodded approvingly. "We'd be lucky to have you." Closing a chapter. The final court appearance came shortly after. Ethan stood before Judge Porter again, but this time he was a changed man. "Mr. Rowland," Judge Porter said, his piercing gaze softer than Ethan remembered, "you've completed your sentence, and by all accounts, you've done so with genuine effort and growth. But I'm curious, what have you learned from this experience?" Ethan took a deep breath, speaking clearly and confidently. "I've learned that my actions affect more people than I realized. I've learned the value of accountability, and that privilege isn't an excuse to avoid responsibility. Most importantly, I've learned that change is possible, but it takes work, and I'm committed to continuing that work." Judge Porter nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well said, Mr. Rowland. Your transformation is a testament to what justice can achieve when paired with the willingness to grow." Case closed. Moving forward, Ethan's commitment to the community center deepened in the months that followed. He took on more responsibilities, helping to launch new programs and mentoring other young people who had been in situations similar to his own. Diego became a regular presence in his life, offering guidance and support. They shared coffee on weekends, talking about everything from life lessons to sports. Diego's children even started calling Ethan Uncle E, a nickname that filled him with unexpected pride. His relationship with his parents also improved. They began to see the person Ethan was becoming rather than the boy he had been, and conversations over family dinners became less strained and more meaningful. The ripple grows. One day, as Ethan walked into the community center, he noticed a young boy sitting in the waiting area, fidgeting nervously. Claire explained that the boy, Michael, had been caught joyriding in his brother's car and was there as part of a new mentorship program Ethan had helped create. Ethan sat down beside Michael, offering a reassuring smile. "Hey," Ethan said, "I used to sit in that same chair, thinking I didn't need anyone's help. Turns out I was wrong. You're already ahead of where I was, just by being here." Michael looked up, his eyes wide. "Really?" "Really," Ethan said. "And I'm here to make sure you don't have to figure it out alone. A life worth living." As the years passed, Ethan's work at the center became a cornerstone of his life. He went back to school, studying community development, and eventually became the director of the Franklin County Community Center. His journey inspired others, turning his mistake into a story of redemption and hope. Ethan Rowland had once been a symbol of privilege and entitlement. Now, he was a beacon of change, proving that even the most reckless paths can lead to redemption when met with accountability, compassion, and the courage to grow. And so, the boy who once dismissed the consequences of his actions became a man who helped others navigate their own challenges, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond the courtroom where it all began.